All right. Welcome, everyone. Well, I know we're all, well, welcome everyone for a start to the latest installment in our lecture and film series on Satyajit Ray. And I know there's one period in life in which you're all very nostalgic about, namely the kind of the late pandemic period where we had masks, social distancing, and Zoom lectures. So to fulfill your kind of yearning for that period, we've got a Zoom lecture on today. You can also put on masks and stay 2 meters away from other people if you want to. Unfortunately, our guest today, Priyadashina Shankar, could not physically make it to Frankfurt due to various logistical issues, but thankfully we still do have Zoom, which means we still can welcome her, if not physically in Frankfurt, at least virtually into the film museum via the kind of screen intermediary. Nothing will stop us. Priya is zooming in from you're in North Carolina right now? Yes? Okay. So it's, I guess, early morning there or late morning there? 11? Whoops,
It's 2 in the afternoon.
It's 2 in the afternoon. Okay, all right. That's a very hospitable hour. She is assistant professor in film studies at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington, having completed her PhD at NYU in the film studies program there, or cinema studies program there. Her kind of focus has always been contemporary Indian cinema, but she has a kind of particular interest in gendered performance and labor. So Priya will be talking to us today about Satyajit Ray's film, Charulata, and just a kind of heads up about the format. Obviously, we're doing this via Zoom. Hopefully the technology holds up. Priya will talk to us a little bit about the film. Then, as normal, we'll have a 10-minute break and then start with the screening of Satyajit Ray's Charulata. And then in that time, Priya can go off and have a cup of tea or do whatever she wants. And then we will all reconvene, us in the auditorium and Priya on the screen, to have a little bit of a Q&A, as is lecture and film tradition. But right now, please join me in welcoming Priya onto our screens to talk to us about Charulata. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everyone. I go by Priya, and my pronouns are she, they. Thank you to Dr. Fairfax for that generous introduction. I must also thank the 3 curators, Dr. Vincenz Heidegger, Dr. Ritika Kaushik, and Dr. Fairfax, for inviting me to be a part of this wonderful lecture and film series, An Eye for the World, the Cinema of Satyajit Ray. Also, a quick and big thank you to Bjorn Schmidt for all his help with setting up the technology. We have our fingers crossed that the technology gods will cooperate. Hopefully, I haven't already jinxed it. I am truly sad and sorry for not being present in person for this lecture at the Deutsche Film Institute and Film Museum, and this is owing to visa issues. I must admit that I have found myself fantasizing about what kind of a trenchant film Satyajit Ray would have made if he got inspired by the bureaucratic nightmares of visa processing. Let me assure you that fantasy is not the topic for today's lecture. Fortunately for all of us, it is Ray's brilliant film Charulata, translated in English as The Lonely Wife, released in 1964. I am grateful that Zoom is allowing me to connect with you both pre and post screening and share my love and passion for this absolutely sparkling film. Since I come to you virtually, I lean upon a PowerPoint to keep this pre-screening lecture hopefully somewhat engaging. The objective of this pre-screening lecture is twofold on my part. One is to give you some contextual information that will hopefully enable you to receive the film better, and to do this without revealing any spoilers or indulging in any analysis, since those are best saved for the post-screening conversation. And 2, to pose certain open-ended questions, or in other words, to instigate certain prompts that you can bear in mind as you view the film, so that hopefully your enjoyment of the film is compounded by that rather than diminished by that. Before I begin to give you this context around Charulata, my first objective, I do want to issue a disclaimer, and this is a disclaimer that perhaps other scholars introducing other Ray films might have issued too. But like many Bengali speakers, you may find me slipping between the two pronunciations of Satyajit Ray's name. So the native Bengali speaker is likely to pronounce it as Satyajit Ray, while the non-Bengali speaker is likely to pronounce it as Satyajit Ray. I am not a native Bengali speaker. I'm not a Bengali by birth. However, I can read, write, and converse in Bengali because I was trained in that during my middle school years. Also, Bengali has been a part of my universe since childhood because my mother grew up in different parts of West Bengal and speaks Bengali fluently and was very deeply entrenched in the culture of Bengal. So you will see me switch between Ray and Rai. I am referring to the same person. It's just the two different pronunciations. So the topic for today's lecture is Charulata, a woman's gaze. And with the introduction of my topic, I'll share my PowerPoint with you now. And let's hope that sharing will go smoothly. So just give me a second as I pull that up. I just want to make sure that you're seeing it fully on the screen. Can somebody just give me a thumbs up from the DFF that this is the right? Okay, great. Thank you. That helps. Okay, so you're not seeing my thumbnails, which is good. So this is the topic for my lecture, Charulata, a woman's gaze. And hopefully by the end of our post-screening conversation, you will be able to see why I have titled the presentation such. Now, to paint the context around the film, there is perhaps another disclaimer that I want to issue before I start painting this context, which is that I'm not giving you all this information to overwhelm your viewing of the film. Without this information, also you will be able to enjoy the film on its own because the film is so brilliant that it completely, entirely speaks on its own. However, in giving you this context, I'm hoping that I'll add to the viewing experience of the film in some ways. So in terms of context, it is perhaps worth beginning with where Ray was in terms of his filmography when he made Charulata. Charulata was released in 1964, and it was Ray's 12th film. Until this time, he had made 10 works of fiction and a documentary, and you have that list on the screen right now. In these fictional works, Ray had so far adapted Bengali novels and short stories, except for one, the film At Number 9 in 1962. He made a film called Kanchenjunga, which was his first original screenplay. But all of these other works have been adaptations. Now, since Charulata is based upon Rabindranath Tagore's novella, Noshtonir, or translated in English as The Broken Nest, some writers have even translated it as The Broken Home, but I prefer the term The Broken Nest, sounds more metaphorical than literal. The Noshtonir, or The Broken Nest, was published in 1901. And because it is an adaptation of Tagore, I believe it is crucial to talk about Ray's filmography in relationship with Tagore. Amongst these previous works, Ray had already adapted a story not written by Tagore, written by a man called Prabhat Kumar Mukhopadhyay, but the premise of the story originated with Tagore in his film Devi, or The Goddess, that was released in 1960. And you see the poster of Devi up on the screen. Ray also adapted 3 of Tagore's short stories for the anthology film Teen Kanya, or Three Girls, in 1961. You see the poster of Teen Kanya on screen right at the corner. And he also made a documentary on Tagore titled Rabindranath Tagore in 1961 to celebrate the centenary of his birth. So 100 years since Tagore's birth, because Tagore was born in 1861, Ray made this documentary. And in his interviews, he talks about it as backbreaking work. Later, beyond these adaptations of Tagore, beyond what you're seeing on the screen now, Ray would go on to adapt one of Tagore's best-known novels called Ghare Baire, or The Home in the World, in 1984. And you see a poster of Ghare Baire next to the documentary by Tagore. And Ghare Baire and Charulata share very many tropes, very many narrative motifs. And we can talk about this a little bit in the post-screening conversation. Now, since it is obvious from Ray's filmography that he was very deeply inspired by Tagore, it is perhaps worth learning a little bit about the man, Rabindranath Tagore. So Tagore was born in 1861, as I have said before. It's not allowing me to move to the next slide. Let me see what I can do to get there. There, okay. So Tagore was born in 1861. He was a Bengali poet, playwright, novelist, philosopher, composer, painter, social reformer. Overall, a towering figure of the Bengali Renaissance. And in 1913, he becomes the first non-European and first lyricist to win the Nobel Prize in Literature. And amongst his many lasting achievements was the foundation in 1921 of what he called his World University. In Bengali, it was the Vishwa Bharati, which he established about 120 miles north of Calcutta in a place called Shantiniketan. Ray incidentally enrolled to study arts on the persistence of his mother. At the age of 19, in 1940, he enrolled to study arts at Shantiniketan. This was really, Tagore was on his last leg. 1940, Ray enrolls. In 1941, Tagore passes away. So Ray did not have much of a direct interaction with Tagore at Vishwa Bharati. And yet, Tagore has had a very deep impression on Ray in many different ways. For example, Tagore's songs, or what Bengalis refer to as Rabindra Sangeet, were a constant influence on Ray right from his childhood, and his paintings since the time Ray studied at the Vishwa Bharati. The Nobel laureate influenced the filmmaker in multiple ways with his writings and art. If you read Tagore's essays, if you read his literary works, you see the imprint of that influence very clearly. And Tagore did not only serve as an inspiration for his 4 screenplays and his documentaries, but in watching his work, you see that there are several references to Tagore interwoven in Ray's entire filmic oeuvre. And you will witness this today when you watch Charulata. There are several references to Tagore evoked through music and in other ways that we can talk about in the post-screening conversation. Now, while Ray did adopt Tagore in several of his films and made the documentary on him, there is something very unique about his adaptation of Noshta Neer into Charulata. And what is that unique thing? The unique thing about this adaptation is that Noshta Neer, the novella Noshta Neer, as written by Tagore, or translated as The Broken Nest, is one of Tagore's most personal stories. Several literary scholars and critics have noted that the novella is a barely disguised autobiographical and intimate account of the triangular affections between Tagore, his elder brother, Jyoti Rindranath, whose picture you see in the center of the screen on the top, uh, and Jyotirindranath's wife, Kadambari Devi, whose picture you see on screen right, the corner screen right, the lady in the sari, the sepia-toned picture. That's Kadambari Devi. So Kadambari married Jyotirindranath on July 5th, 1868, at the age of 9. And this young age of the bride was a common practice at the time. She was 10 years younger than her husband and nearly the same age as her brother-in-law, Rabindranath. She was barely 2 years older to him. Kadambari and Rabindranath quickly became friends and playmates, and there is speculation through some of Tagore's published letters that he wrote from London to Bengal to Kadambari when he was away in London, when he went there to study. Through those letters, there has been speculation that there bloomed a romantic relationship between them. What is tragic about this love story is that Kadambari died by suicide on 21st April 1884 at the young age of 25, 4 months after Tagore's marriage to Mrinalini Devi. Mrinalini Devi's maiden name was Bhavatarani, but Tagore named her Mrinalini Devi. And the image that you see on the screen left, the black and white image of the man and woman together, that is Rabindranath Tagore with his wife Mrinalini Devi, close after their wedding. The two images that you see above, flanking that image, the top and the bottom, are two publications of the novella Noshtuneer. The one on the top is in Bengali, and the one at the bottom you see is the English translation. And there have been several English translations. This is one of the later ones. There have been earlier ones. As early as 1971, there was an English translation. So this story, this context really informs the novella Noshtuneer, but also informs the film Charulata effectively. And you will see that how when you watch the film. In an interview with Andrew Robinson, Ray reveals that he had seen a very early manuscript of Noshtuneer with marginalia, which refer many times to a figure called Hecate. And Hecate was Rabindranath's nickname for Kadambari, for his beloved sister-in-law. Ray says, open quotes, and I have put the quote up on the screen so you can actually read it as I read it out to you. Open quotes, there is even a profile portrait sketch, the sort that one would do when one is groping for ideas and not actually writing, which is obviously of Kadambari. She was at the back of his mind, there's no doubt of that. And that, I thought, was significant. Close quotes. This is an interview of Ray given to Andrew Robinson in the book, The Inner Eye. This is the book I'm quoting from. I have a really old copy of the book, about 25 years old. And he talks about this influence of Kadambari on Noshtuneer. And the importance of this relationship to Tagore can be gauged by a confession that Tagore makes to the painter Nandalal Bose. He was very close to this painter. He makes a confession to him in his late 70s that it was Kadambari's eyes which lay behind the hundreds of haunting portraits of women he painted in old age. And you see some of these portraits up there on the screen. I've tried to curate some of them for you. The one on the far left is done by ink on paper, and that one hangs at the National Gallery of Modern Art in Delhi. And that one has also been reproduced, that particular painting, in certain books on world art. I actually had a fat book here on my table, but I think it went back up on the shelf. where I've seen that same reproduction. So that first image on the left is one of the iconic Tagore portraits that he drew in his later age, but it is one of Kadambari Devi by his own confession. Like much Tagore did, Noshtonir, the novella, received adverse criticism from Bengalis at the time. And it's kind of obvious why that would be. But still, the Bengalis resented the extramarital affair between familial relations, shaking the foundations of a traditional family life. Ray was very aware of these reactions before he set to work on his adaptation. And if we have time to discuss the reception of the film in the post-screening discussion, we will see that some Bengalis were still sensitive to the issue 6 decades later when the film comes out, when Ray's Charulata is released. And I can talk about Ray's response to that reaction from the audiences. In the novella, there is something about the time period that Ray changes from the novella, and I did want to talk about that a little bit. In the novella, it seems that Tagore is vague about the exact time when the story is set. Ray chooses to settle for a particular year and month for the story. And he researches this. He talks in his interviews about spending time at the National Libraries in Calcutta, trying to pinpoint a month, an year, when he would like to fix the film. He wanted to give it that kind of density, a particular date, a particular time, a particular day. And his research leads him to the late 1870s rather than 1901, the date when the novella is published. And this date is preferred by some of the English translations as sort of the date in which the story is set, so that many of the translators treat 1901 as contemporaneous to the narrative of the novel. But Ray chooses to go backwards, and he decides to fix the date as April 1879. And he evokes that through various references in the film. I hope you will be able to pick up some of them. But there is a density of sound and images that give us this information, that it is April 7th or April 9th in 1879, and it's the months of April and May in 1879 that we are talking about. So this is one difference from the novella, where the time is not fixed, where the time is more vague. We understand that it is the late 1800s. It is bordering to the late 19th century, but Tagore is not fixing it. Ray is fixing it for us. The other difference in terms of time that happens between the novel and the film is that Tagore's novella, if you read it, it covers years. So you get a sense in the novella of, for example, there is a newspaper in the film, and you get the sense that the early days of the newspaper, what that was like. You get that sense from reading the literary work. In Ray's adaptation of the film, all that is compressed. You do not see anything beyond the here and the now that is going on. And the here and the now is a very fixed time period. And I will not spell out for you what my interpretation of that time period is, what is the time span within which the story unfolds, but you will get a sense that it is a compressed time period. And we can talk about it, what that compressed time period feels like. Is it a month? Is it one season? Is it 2 months? It is 3 months? What does that feel like to us? But clearly, Ray makes that other change of compressing the story in terms of narrative time. And there are some allusions in the film that might talk about an earlier time, but Tagore went explicitly to references that were about the earlier years in the lives of the characters, which Ray does not do. Moving on, beyond Tagore, it is important to be aware of another literary icon during this period, because the film makes several references to this literary icon. And his name is Bankim Chand Chattopadhyay. Chattopadhyay's last name is often anglicized as Chatterjee, and hence you will also hear him referred to as Bankim Chandra Chatterjee. Now, who was this man? Who was Bankim Chandra Chatterjee? He was actually the most popular Bengali novelist of this period, the period that we are talking about in the film Charulata, the late 1870s, the early 1880s. What is to be noted is that when Charulata is set, which is 1880 or 1879, Chatterjee is at the height of his fame. He is a leading light of the Bengali Renaissance. And I'll talk about the Renaissance in a moment. I'll contextualize that to you. But there is this cultural movement, and a movement of many kinds, not just a cultural movement, very much a literary movement. Bankim Chandra Chatterjee is at the center of that movement. And he belongs to a generation that precedes Tagore's generation. So Bankim was born in 1838, and he joins government service in 1858. And in the service years, he rises to the position of a magistrate and a revenue officer till his retirement in 1891. But while working as a government servant, he pursues a parallel career. And this parallel career is as a novelist, as an essayist, as an editor. And by 1880, when Charulata is set, he has written 9 novels in Bengali, and a further 5 were to follow before his death in 1894. So Bankim exerted a literary and a personal influence over Tagore in his formative years. And the journal that Bankim founded and edited, it was a Bengali literary magazine called the Bongo Darshan, made an overwhelming impression on the teenage Rabindranath and his beloved sister-in-law, his muse, Kadambari Devi. They both really looked forward to reading this literary magazine when it came out. And Tagore, in one of his, in a chronicle of his early years, of his boyhood years, talks about how it was painful to wait for the next issue of Bongo Darshan. And it was even more painful to wait for it because he could not get his hands on it till the adults in the home had gotten his hands. So he's still a child, he's still a teenage boy when he's very influenced by this literary magazine, Bongo Darshan. And Bankim actually mentored him and helped him publish his works at a very young age. So Bankim really recognized in Tagore the kind of literary luminary he was to become. So very formative influence. And the reason I'm giving you this information is because you will see numerous references to Bankim in the film Charulata. And he almost works like a leitmotif in the film, the name Bankim, and you will sense where all it comes. Now, to talk about this screen, what you're seeing right now, there are 2 images of Bankim on the stamp and the man's portrait. But on the far right corner of the screen, you see the literary magazine Bongo Darshan that he edited and that Rabindranath read with such relish. So moving on from the context of Tagore and Bankim, it is important to also talk a little bit about the Bengal or the Bengali Renaissance itself. Because when Ray fixes 1879 as the year in which the narrative unfolds, it has the advantage of being at a time when the intellectual and cultural ferment of the Bengali Renaissance is at its height. It's absolutely at its peak, at its zenith. And here's a word about this Renaissance. This was a cultural, social, intellectual, and artistic movement that took place in the Bengal region of the colonized India. And when I say the Bengal region of the colonized India, I mean today what is modern West Bengal, but what is also the nation of Bangladesh, which was created in 1971, much later. That entire Bengal region, the Bengal presidency of the colonized time, there is this great movement there, starting from the late 18th century. So some historians talk about the Battle of Plassey in 1757 as the starting point, but starting somewhere from the late 18th century to the early 20th century. And some historians and scholars talk about the death of the Bengal Renaissance with the death of Rabindranath Tagore. Others think of Satyajit Ray as the last Renaissance man. And that is, that's debatable about when this Renaissance ends or if it ends. But in general, people understand it as playing a role from the late 18th century to the early 20th century. Its ideas have significantly been attributed to the rise of anti-colonialist and nationalist thoughts and actions. So there were not only reformers who worked on social issues during this period, but reformers who had begun to think about the Indian independence. And on the screen right, you see an image of a man who was thought to be the father of the Bengali Renaissance. His name is Raja Ram Mohan Roy. He was largely seen as a social reformer, and social reform was central to this cultural and intellectual ferment. And that's an image of Raja Ram Mohan Roy that you see on screen left. On screen right, you see a lot of figures. And of course, Raja Ram Mohan Roy is at the top on that flag of India. That is the flag of India in the background, the green, the saffron, the white, and the spokes of the wheel, the 24 spokes of the wheel in the center of the Indian flag. So you do see Raja Ram Mohan Roy right at the pinnacle, at the zenith, the father, right at the top. But you see Tagore's image at the bottom. And in between the three images that you see are those right after Ram Mohan Roy, you see the image of a man called Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, who was also a very well-known social reformer. And then you see the image of Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, the novelist, the writer, the essayist that I talked about earlier. So there are these important cultural figures from the Bengal Renaissance that I wanted to alert you to. The philosophical basis of this movement was a sort of mix of liberalism and modernity, and that informed this movement. There's a well-known historian, Sumit Sarkar. He notes that while this period was revered and regarded with great nostalgia throughout the 19th and the 20th century, a more critical view of this period has emerged since the 1970s. And the criticality is due to a new focus on the colonialist origins of the Bengal Renaissance. And this more critical view of the Renaissance is evident in the characterization of the two male protagonists in Charulata. The husband, Bhupati, is an archetypal figure of the Renaissance. And so is his cousin, Amol, in his own way. And while Ray treats the two male protagonists quite sympathetically, as Ray always does, fondly and sympathetically and affectionately, they do end up serving as a twofold indictment of the Renaissance in the hands of first Tagore and then Ray. Now, the Bengali Renaissance is also intimately connected to the evolution of a particular class of people in Bengal. And these people came to be referred as the Bhadralok. If the Bhadralok were to be translated in English, it would simply mean gentleman or a well-mannered person. But the Bhadralok represented more than the gentleman or the well-mannered person, and I'll talk to you about that in a minute. So in 1835, during the British colonial rule of India, the British rulers decide to introduce Western education in India by passing a legislation. And they start setting up schools and colleges where English becomes the primary medium of instruction. It has been famously remarked that it was designed to produce a particular class of people who would be, in quotes, Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in moral, and in intellect, close quotes. And this quote was actually made by a man called Lord Macaulay, Lord Thomas Babington Macaulay. And he actually talks about this in one of his minutes on India. It was these treatises that he wrote called the Minutes, in which he talks about the fact that we cannot rule millions of people if we don't create a class who can communicate with them for us. So Macaulay famously said that we need a class which is Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinion, in moral, and in intellect. Now, such a class does emerge, and this class is the Bhadralok. It is the bourgeois elite whose exposure to European literature, science, and philosophy sparks an enthusiasm for the liberal humanist traditions of the West. And this Bhadralok then comes to function as middlemen between the colonial rulers and its non-English speaking subjects, holding administrative posts all over the empire. And I used the word middleman, and it just struck me that incidentally, and I think you've seen this film as a part of this series, is also the title of Ray's 1975 film, Jono Aronyo, which translates as The Middleman in English. So there is some connection there too. Now, Darius Cooper, whose quote I have put on the screen, he notes, open quotes, it was through their efforts, and by their he means the Bhadralok, that an uneasy alliance was forged between Western liberalism and traditional Eastern thinking, which brought two disparate cultures together in what gets to be known as the Bengal Renaissance. Now, since I have sort of built up this contextual information for you in terms of the historical movements, the social changes, the cultural changes taking place, I do want to give you one more piece of contextual information, which follows from this discussion and which will prove useful in the viewing of the film. Before I begin to talk a little bit about the context of the production, and I will just check in between with someone about how I'm doing for time. But one more little thing before we begin to talk about production. So one more contextual information which follows from this discussion and which will prove useful in the viewing of the film is that film scholars and critics have noted that Charulata is a complete fusion of an Eastern and Western sensibility, owing to which viewing difficulties arise. In his books, Satyajit Ray, The Inner Eye, Andrew Robinson notes, open quotes, the film conceals almost as much from the Bengali who's unfamiliar with Western civilization as it does, in other words, from the Westerner who does not know Bengal, close quotes. In an interview with the film magazine Sight and Sound in 1982, Ray himself elaborates on the trouble faced by the Western viewer. And I quote him here on the PowerPoint, and the quote goes, "The setting is a Western-style mansion. The decor is Victorian. The dialogue strewn with references to Western literature and politics. But beneath the veneer of familiarity, the film is chock-a-block with details to which he, by which he means the Western viewer, has no access. Snatches of song, literary allusions, domestic details, an entire scene where Charu and her beloved Amal talk in alliterations, thereby setting a hopeless task for the subtitler, all give the film a density missed by the Western viewer," close quotes. So I did want to alert you to this part because this is important to the film. But Ray particularly exemplifies this difficulty by talking about a particular aspect that is very central to the film's narrative and that may be completely missed by a Western viewer. And I'm particularly highlighting this quote so you're aware of this as you view the film. This is what Ray says, open quotes. There is a Bengali convention about the relations between a wife and her debor, her younger brother-in-law. It's always a very affectionate relationship, and she's free to come out before him, not before other men. The brother-in-law might well be studying in college with lots of free time, making demands on her to cook certain foods. In fact, it goes even closer than that. It always verges on a kind of intimacy, close quotes. I'll stop there because if I read out the rest of Ray's quote, it will reveal certain things about the narrative, which I'd rather you experience and absorb firsthand. So I have contextualized, Ray's filmography, his Tagorean adaptations, the story behind the very personal Noshtonir, the Bengali Renaissance, the Bhadralo, and the Eastern-Western blend in the film. And then I wanted to transition about talking about the production of the film. But before I do that, I want to just quickly check with someone to see how am I doing for time. Do we have more time or should we transition to the screening now? I can't hear you, Daniel, sorry. You were muted. Could you put it in the chat or unmute yourself?
Oh, yeah, maybe.
Yeah, I have 10 more minutes? Okay, that's great. Okay, 10 is good. 10 is great. Then I can give you a little bit of more context about the production background of the film. So the production of the film is, one of the things that is important to know about the production of this film is that Charulata is often rated as Ray's finest work. And whenever he was pressed in interviews to name what was his favorite, he has named Charulata as his own personal favorite. And Ray has always called it the one with the fewest flaws. Now, in an interview with Robinson, he explicates on this. Why is it the one with the fewest flaws? Open quotes, I had more time. For the first time, I insisted on no deadlines. I said that I will hand over the film when it is ready, and then you make the arrangements for releasing it. So I had more time for precision work in the final cutting to try out various alternatives. And the casting was so perfect, close quotes. Ray has no doubt that this has much to do with the film's final quality, him having time. Now, I want to briefly signal to the production attributes of Charulata, and within that, I want to talk about setting, camera work, sound, and music, and performance before moving towards the closing. And I'll try to do this very quickly so I'm not impinging on the screening time in any way. So for setting, it was a mostly indoor setting. The film is set largely indoors, and this indoor setting to the film is extremely significant as it serves almost like a character within the film. And it is, you will see when you watch the film, it is introduced right at the outset. Ray and his longtime art director, Banshi Chandragupta, whose image you see on the screen right now, visited several Calcutta houses built in the Victorian period to sort of recreate this setting in the studio. Ray was somebody who accompanied Chandragupta as they shopped together for suitable furniture, decoration, and props. And in a 1965 interview, Chandragupta remarked, open quotes, in Charulata, the bedroom scenes were dominated by a huge Victorian bed. We arranged the whole set around this feature, piece by piece, detail by detail. This is putting it very badly, but is the only way I can describe my method. Close quotes. So the Bengal, because we've talked about the setting, let's also talk a little bit about the camera work and the sound design of the film. So in terms of camera work, Ray had always worked with two cinematographers, Shubrata Mitra, whose image you see on the top of the screen, and another cinematographer by the name of Shomindu Roy, whose image you see towards the bottom of the screen. Starting with Pother Panchali, he had collaborated with Subroto Mitra, and with Shomendu Roy, he did Teen Konya, Rabindranath Tagore, the documentary, and Abhijan. However, starting with Charulata, Ray began to operate the camera himself. In one of his famous essays called Some Aspects of My Craft, in this collection called Our Films, Their Films, which is all of Ray's writing, he says this, he remarks, open quotes, ever since Charulata, I have been operating the camera myself. This is not because I do not trust my cameraman's operational abilities, but because I want to know exactly at all times how a shot is going, not only in terms of acting, but of acting viewed from a children's setup, which imposes a particular spatial relationship between the actors. This relationship may keep changing in the shot through movement of the actors or of the camera or both. Through the lens is the only position from which these changes can be precisely gauged. Close quotes. Philip Kemp, in his Criterion essay on Charulata, which is titled Calm Without, Fire Within, this particular essay in the Criterion booklet right here, he adds to this point and he quotes Ray, evoking yet another advantage of operating the camera, open quotes. I realized that working with new actors, they are more confident if they don't see me. They are less tense. I remain behind the camera and I see better and get the exact frame, close quotes. So moving on from the camera work, let's talk a little bit about the sound design of the film, which is very, very complex. By the time Ray was making Charulata, he had already composed the full musical scores for his previous films, Kanchenjunga, Abhijan, and Mahanagar. And in an interview in 1980, Ray indicated that by Charulata, he was exploring, open quotes, the possibilities of fusing Indian and Western music. It began to interest me from Charulata on. I began to realize that at some point, music is one. Close quotes. There are two of Tagore's compositions that provide a basis for much of the music in the film, and they act as leitmotifs. The first one is called Mama Chitte Niti Nritya, and it's a very simple and catchy tune, and it is a tune that is really used to train beginners in Rabindra Sangeet, and sometimes used to teach young girls dance steps. There's a second song of Tagore, which Ray uses in an interwoven way in the film. It's called Hule Hule Dole Dole, and it's from an early Tagore dance drama, but it's based on a Scottish tune, and that complements the Western elements of the film very well. And Ray weaves variations of both these songs through the film. There is yet another song of Ray, which has been of Tagore, which has been prominently used in the film. It's called Ami Chini Gu Chini Tomare. That translates as, I know you, O foreign woman, O strange woman. And this song was composed by Rabindranath's elder brother, Jyotirendranath. And it was given music. The music was given by Jyotirendranath, the musical composition. The words were given by Rabindranath. And this is a song in the film that Amol sings for Charu. Now, the song is sung. It's a beautiful moment in the film. You'll really enjoy it. Visually, orally, it's a scintillating moment. But one of the anecdotal things about this is that the song is sung by Kishore Kumar, the most famous playback singer of Bombay cinema in the 1960s. And recently, a few years back, not very many years back, Satyajit Ray's son, Sandeep Ray, released the letter written by Kishore Kumar to Ray when Ray invited him to sing for the film. And I've put the letter on the PowerPoint. You can easily find the letter on the internet and read it. It's such a sweet and affectionate letter where Kumar accepts the offer but invites Ray to come to Bombay to record the song rather than Calcutta because he cannot spare the time. But apart from the music and songs, Ray devoted a lot of attention to getting the correct street sounds for 1880 Calcutta. And he researched literary sources. He went back to some of his own childhood memories, the memories of older people in his family. And because of this, you will see that Charulata is as much an oral delight as it is a visual delight. We can talk a little bit about the performance of the film, but I think in favor of time, I will sacrifice that and we can return that in the post-screening conversation. I just want to alert you to so the performances we will talk about when you watch the film. But I did want to alert you to two things. One is that you can see Ray's film as a Tagorean adaptation. But I would also propose that this particular film, Charulata, can also be seen as part of Ray's Madhubi trilogy. Because Madhubi Mukherjee, the central female actress in this film, did 3 films with Ray, all women-centric films. Mahanagar, or The Big City, preceding Charulata, the year right before Charulata, then Charulata, and then Kapurush, The Coward, which is a short film made by Ray as part of, it's a companion piece to a film called Mahapurush, Kapurush or Mahapurush. And Madhubi is in all these films. So you can also see Charulata as a part of Ray's Madhubi trilogy. The one more way that might be the most useful way of seeing Charulata, in which I think we can focus in our post-screening conversation, is that starting with Mahanagar and realizing it very fully with Charulata and Kapurush, Ray begins to move away from films that are an exploration of male protagonists, and his films begin to center around women and the inner recesses of a woman's mind. And each film, Mahanagar, Charulata, and Kapurush, coincidentally each starring Madhubi Mukherjee, are a development from the former in terms of its psychological progression. So Mahanagar, which you've seen, if Mahanagar essays the hesitant emergence of the middle-class housewife determining her own course as a working woman in post-independent India, Charulata is a step up in terms of a woman's discovery of her inner chambers, her Andar Mahal, a place from where she can explore making the difficult transition from the long 19th century to the onset of the 20th century. And this aspect is truly worth reflecting upon as you watch the film. Before I wrap up, I want to also leave you with this idea that my talk is called Charulata, A Woman's Gaze, because the reason I've titled the talk this way is because I don't want to talk more about it because it will reveal things about the film, but we will discuss this. And my very last slide, where I want to leave you with some prompts to view Charulata, not meant as an homework. I am a teacher, so there is a bit of that in this presentation. But these are some prompts that you can think through as you view the film. What is the kind of contrast the film draws upon? What are the leitmotifs you identify in the film? In what way is Charulata obsessed with the written word? And why do film scholars and critics find Charulata a highly reflexive film? And to me, one of the most important questions is, how is the female gaze foregrounded in this film? And also, how do you receive the ending of the film? I will stop there because we've gone beyond, I think, beyond the 45-minute time limit, certainly. But I'll stop there, and I just want to say that with that, I give you Ray's most luminous film, Charulata, from 1964. It is 117 minutes in length. It is black and white. Please enjoy it, and I hope to see you after the screening. Thank you.
Yeah, it's looking good. So we can do questions. Maybe I'll just kick things off. The ending is very striking, with this kind of reversion to still photography. Do you have a a reading for the ending, or do we also know? I mean, did Satyajit Ray talk about why he makes that choice to kind of end on this kind of, I guess, a suspended note, and denote that through the use of still photography?
Mm-hmm. Yes, so Ray talks about it explicitly in some of his interviews. He addresses this question of why the use of freeze frames in the ending, and why a sort of a regression to still photography rather than moving images. So Ray makes 2 points. One is that he was inspired by the ending of Truffau's 400 Blows, the famous freeze frame in Truffau's film. And he explicitly acknowledges that he was inspired by that to use these freeze frames at the end of Charulata. But the other more significant thing that he says is that the way in which the novel ends, the way in which Tagore writes the ending, Tagore ends with a particular word, the book, and that word in Bengali is thak. And thak means let it be. Now, what happens in the story, in Tagore's story, is that Bhupati says to Charu, I have to go to Mysore for a trip. And Charu apparently says to Bhupati, take me with you. And then he hesitates, and she says, Hak, which literally means let it be. Now, Ray says he was looking for a visual equivalent of the word Thak, or let it be, because he feels that that moment is a moment of fissure between the couple in the novel, but he doesn't know how to translate that fissure. So apparently he had written a different ending. And Soumitra Chatterjee, the actor who plays Amar, talks about this in a book actually that I was reading last night. There is this book that Soumitra Chatterjee has written called The Master and I, in which he talks about how the ending of Charulata was a different one. And that when Ray gave the script to Soumitra and he read the ending, he was very dissatisfied with the ending. And Ray asked him, what do you think of the ending? And he said, I don't think it's quite right. And Ray didn't say much to that, but he rewrote the ending. And he was very happy that he rewrote when he had reworked the ending and gotten what he did get. And so this was meant, the ending is meant to communicate a non-finality open to interpretation to the audience. Ray was somewhere aspiring to that, I feel.
That's really great. I wonder if this sense of a kind of non-finality or irresolution as well is, and it really kind of works within the logic of the story, because it's really, there is this situation, this kind of triangular relationship, this kind of love that isn't, is very pure, but kind of isn't acted upon, and there doesn't seem to be any kind of way for a breakthrough to happen in that kind of, let's say, in that double bind that the characters find themselves. So this is also, in a sense, Ray's way of kind of giving us a narrative that doesn't really like work with the standard idea of a kind of, narrative climax that kind of resolve the issue. And, instead we just kind of have this sense of stasis almost.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think stasis is a very apt word for that moment.
Yeah. The other thing, I mean, a lot to talk about in the film, but I also found it interesting, and we kind of, the image is very strongly associated with the film, but Charulata's use of the opera glasses, which you also showed in your PowerPoint, which seems to be a very overt signal to the audience that we're kind of seeing the world through her eyes, perhaps. I mean, you also talked about kind of the woman's gaze as being the kind of, let's say, operative structure of the film. I wonder if you could speak more about that kind of motif of this kind of opera glasses. And we even get the kind of, shot of the kind of the world she's seeing mattered, as if it's kind of, as if we're seeing it through the the lens of these opera glasses.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the opera glasses are, of course, a very important motif for the film because they come right at the beginning in Charu's character and the setting and the stories introduced to us through the opera glasses. It immediately sets her loneliness. It sets her from the world outside, the interiority of her world, the confinement of her world, her ability to access that world through sounds and an opera glass, not being able to be outside and look outside, but only look through the opera glass. Of course, within her space, in her most intimate relationship that she has with her husband, Bhupati, she also has to use the opera glass to look at him because even though he's present in the physical space with her, and they have a nice marriage, there is still distance where Bhupati really doesn't have the time and the sensitivity to access her. And so in that sense, it's a harsh commentary on her relationship when she holds up the opera glasses to look at her husband too. And the way that opera glass is flung down with a flourish, that's quite a maneuver of the camera that Ray does there, which gives us that emotional turbulence that Charu experiences as she looks at her own husband through a distant, by distancing him. The opera glasses come again when she's sitting on the swing and she looks at the childless, at the woman with the child, making her cognizant of her own childlessness, her loneliness, and perhaps a schism in her relationship with her husband. All of that, she is suddenly aware of looking through the opera glasses, looking through the lorgnette, and then she moves it to look at her brother-in-law. And once again, as she looks at Amal, her brother-in-law, through the opera glasses, it's suddenly as if Charu is aware of the feelings within herself for him. The vibrations of those feelings we can see mapped on her face. It's almost like the opera glass is a seismograph to access her interiority. So the opera glass really, I think, for Charu works as the more she looks outwards through it, the more inwards she's able to look. It's a connection between the outside world and Charu's interiority, Charu's psychological being, her desirous being, her erotic being, her femininity. All of those things she's connected to by looking outwards through the opera glass. So the opera glass does become very important. But the opera glass, I also feel, works as a great kind of a visual fun in the film, along with a series of other devices through which we look. So at one point, Amal in the film holds up a magnifying glass. So I think there are a lot of metaphors in the film for short-sightedness of characters and Charu's gaze, which seems to be a little more nuanced, a little more reflective and contemplative than the gaze of the men around her. And so I think the opera glass also functions along with the magnifying glass, along with the pince-nez that Bhupati wears, as a series of devices through which vision is foregrounded in the film.
Mm-mm. I mean, it's also very striking that, the opera glass is also kind of her way of kind of finding a release from her surrounds, I think you mentioned, because we get one scene where they're on the kind of seashore, but apart from that, she really is kind of enclosed within this house, the space of their house, like which she almost barely ever leaves. I mean, the husband's always going to the printing press and so on and so forth in his kind of political circles, whereas she just is really confined. There's not a sense that he's kind of keeping her there against her will or something, but somehow she's like barely able to leave this house, it seems, throughout most of the film. That this really is almost in some sense, very claustrophobic film.
Absolutely.
For Charulata.
This is something that perhaps I should have also said as a part of contextualizing. So at this point of time, historically, women of this class in Bengal and in most parts of India were not really allowed to go beyond the inner quarters of the house. So there is a real physical separation built in these wealthy households between the inner quarters and the outer quarters. And the woman can access some part of the outer quarters when men who are outsiders are not present in those quarters. So, for example, Charu can go to the living room and access the books from the library, but she cannot really go beyond the point. So she cannot really step out of the house. So the only way she can look out at the outside world is by opening those shuttered windows and by listening to the sounds on the street. So it is very much a condition of her being where she is in history. She does not have an access to the world outside. When in the first sequence, when she's looking through the window outside, the little shots, montage of shots that you get in that scene, you also see palanquin bearers holding on to a palanquin. And that probably indicates that a woman is traveling in a covered palanquin and men are, transporting her from one place to the other. So women could not travel, especially women of a certain class, the class that Charu comes from. She could not access the outside independently and on her own. So that is important to realize about her condition and situation.
Yeah, that's interesting because there's also a contradiction then with her husband, who has this kind of progressive mindset when it comes to kind of the political realm. Like the kind of external political realm, let's say, is kind of like, it's like wanting the Liberals to win the election in the UK and so on and so forth, like kind of like yearning for this kind of national liberation for India. But that contrasts with his kind of just innate retention of this kind of traditional conception of married life, which Charulata is kind of straining against, but he doesn't kind of recognize her own kind of confinement in a sense.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the little things stuck in there again for a knowing audience, and this is also something that I didn't realize when I was first watching the film, is that the first novel of Bankim Chandra Chatterjee that Charu actually picks off from the shelf is a novel called Kapal Kundala, in which the heroine of the novel, the female protagonist of the novel, is a woman who has been brought up by a hermit in the forests. And then she's married off, and she can never settle into domesticity. She can never settle into the confines of domesticity and moves out of the house and whatever happens to her. But it's sort of, the film is a critique of the confinement of domesticity towards women right from the outset in some ways. And so is the novel Noshtamir. But there are cues like that about Charu struggling with the confines of her situation.
Yep, great. We'll pass to the audience. Björn has a roving mic, so we can bring it right here to kick ourselves off.
Does it work? Yes. Okay. Yes, thanks very much for your lecture. I have a question about the female gaze. I think, if I understand you correctly, the female gaze is like the looking inside of yourself. It's the feminine, in your femininity and so on. I wonder if this is such a good description if you think about other theory, film theory, where you say, okay, there's the male gaze, you know all that, I'm sure. And you can say the only time Rai shows the breaking free of Charulata is at the seashore scene. There she's on top of the low husband, so to speak, and makes the proposals in a more or less public. It's not really a public, it's only two people there, but it's the seashore, of course, it's not confined. But otherwise in the film, most of the times, okay, the male actors are always on top, you know, they're always bigger than her, and in a sense. And I wonder if I would really see artistically speaking, a female gaze there in Ray. And the next question is, when the film started, my association was with Flaubert and Don Quixote, okay? I mean, these people live in their fantasies, right? Don Quixote lives in his fantasies, right? Madame Flaubert, Emma Bovary, lives in her fantasies too. Her husband is a doctor, very much down to earth, pragmatic, like her husband, like Charu's husband. And of course, that's not very interesting in a sense. It's not poetic. It's not full of fantasy. And in a sense, I find that a bit cliche-like, right? And there are a lot of things explained in the film. And my favorite film by Ray is Jal-Jogga, Music Room, okay, which is not so explicit, okay, where he works much more with cineastic images, reduced images, and in particular he uses mirrors in this film a lot. In this film we hardly see any mirrors. So you only have the gaze outside, so to speak, outside the house or outside with your opera classes. And this is not an inward way of looking. It's not questioning yourself. So in a way, I totally distrust your theory of female gaze.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting reading that you have of the film, and I'll try. You said a few different things in your response to the film, and I appreciate those things. George Schauger, The Music Room, is of course a brilliant film, and a film which is a very different character. But Charulata to me is a very, very important film in the way it tries to access the inner recess of the mind of a woman. I see Ray aspiring to do this work in Mahanagar, or the big city, followed by Charulata, and finally in Kapurush, the coward. And while I see in what ways are you evoking Madame Bovary or Flaubert here or Don Quixote in these characterizations, I do not see, I do not find Madame Bovary and Charulata comparable characters. In fact, there is an adaptation of Madame Bovary in Indian cinema. It's a film called Maya Mem Sahab, made by Ketan Mehta. It's a much later work from the 1980s. And it's, I do find, I would still argue that I do find that Charu's outward glance very much becomes the revealing inward gaze that combines her solitude, her self-consciousness, and a sensitivity which initiates a transformative journey of self-reflection and inquiry. Because I think for Charu, it is a leap to suggest, to reach where she's reaching at the seashore. So she's gone through this entire emotional tumult through the narrative of the film in falling for her brother-in-law, and then kind of still coming to terms with her marital situation and going with her husband on a seashore holiday and suggesting to him that the newspaper can be both political and literary, can have both politics and culture at the same time. To me, that is a very, in 1880 India, for Charulata to suggest that, for me, is a feminist act. And the reason why that act is so important is because I feel that Charu, through her outward gaze, through her erotic gaze, if you will, through a sensual gaze, if you will, has accessed her own creativity and is able to now write. She's written herself into existence now, and she's willing to do that publicly through the newspaper. And so in that sense, I do think that Charu's gaze, or the female gaze in this film, is a very potent one. And I'm not giving that gaze to the male director of the film, but rather to the female protagonist in the film. I hope I addressed some of what you were trying to get at.
Maybe just a follow-up question on the particularly that suggestion made by Charulata to kind of co-edit the newspaper, and her husband can be responsible for politics and she can do culture. And this almost seems too perfect as a kind of solution. Like, is that, like, are we supposed to give us any credence, or is this a kind of fantasy that could never be realized, that is kind of like, you know, obviously like way too dreamy and would meet with a kind of, you know, I mean, it's one thing for her to publish writing, but to actually be an editor of a newspaper at this point might not be so socially tenable.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, you know, if not that there were no women writers at this time, there are figures within the Bengali Renaissance, women artists, women writers, not a very large number, but a few significant ones which were powerful voices. Namely, there is a woman, Ruqayya Hussain, who wrote, who was very prolific and who was seen as a prolific figure within the Bengal Renaissance. But I think the idea of Charu contributing to the newspaper is speaking to the tenor of the film or the tenor of the story, which is that there is a dialectic through the film between the inner and the outer, the private and the public, the masculine and the feminine, the politics and the culture, English and Bengali. And the one that connects these two, for me, all of these are connected only through Charu's gaze, which here is the literal gaze of the camera in the film. But there is this whole, and this inner and outer dichotomy is at work in a film like Mahanagar too. And then we'll again see it in Ghore Baire, the home and the world. And the home and the world is maps it out much more literally, where there is a scene in which the husband actually takes the wife from the inner chambers of the house to the outer chambers of the house to meet his friend. And it's a very momentous 1 minute in the film, shot in dissolves and slow motion, to mark this momentous occasion of the woman crossing the threshold of the house from the inner to the outer quarters. But I think this dialectic of the separation that is built through the narrative, the separation of literature and politics, through Bhupati and Amal's characters, Charu is the kind of intermediary that can meld that in some ways. And so I think the suggestion is not so much, does not have a logical or a realistic function in the film, but more of a rhetorical function of the sense of bridging these things which are trying to dialogue with each other, but are really seen at crossroads.
We could perhaps also speak of a dialectic between the time in the film, the times the film was set, but also the time of the film when it's made. And perhaps moments like that are also Satyajit Ray kind of almost overtly speaking to his own time and to what's possible in his own time, what he's kind of saying should be possible in his own time, rather than necessarily what was kind of realistic in the historical period in which the film is set. Is this also a message of kind of like a potential female liberation in the India of the 1960s that Satyajit Ray is kind of gesturing towards?
Right. I think that's a great point, Daniel. I hadn't really thought through till you proposed that, but yes, it might be something on Ray's mind. To me, it seems that, you know, if you look at his initial works, right from Pothe Panchali up till Mahanagar, he's constantly working with themes of boyhood and manhood and masculinity in different ways in different films, whether it's the kind of crumbling masculinity or the crumbling feudalism we see in a film like Jolachagar, or this entire trajectory of the journey of Appu's journey of a boy to the teenage, youthful Appu in Aparajito, to the fully grown man in the world of Appu. You constantly have this mapping of male characters as central protagonists and their stories and their journeys. You know, as Appu runs to the train, Durga falls by the wayside. And through the trilogy, women keep falling to the wayside, whether it's the old aunt or Durga in Pothe Panchali, it's the mother in Aparajito, and it's the wife in Apu Shanshar. All these female characters keep dying as Apu's journey goes on, progresses, as history progresses, as India progresses. And I feel like Ray in this trajectory comes to a bit of a standstill with Mahanagar, where he begins to centralize women characters in his films. And he does that for a while, and then again, when we begin to get his city films, there is again a sort of an unraveling. There are narratives where masculinity is once again unraveling. And so there is this middle period of Ray's cinema I see as one where he's explicitly working with the woman's question, particularly in these three films that he does with Madhavi. And Charulata, in that sense, is aspiring and reflective of the times that Ray is living in very much. So not just about where they are historically in the time, but one of the things that I find very unique about Charulata's character in Charulata is that she's able to imagine the modern in a way that the male characters are not able to imagine. So even though this woman is confined, it is through her mind that even when she's not able to articulate it, she's able to imagine the modern. And I think Ray is giving us that imagination of modernity through Charulata.
Any questions from the audience? Okay, another one here.
Okay, another follow-up question. I'm sorry to bother you. There are quite a few references to Shakespeare in the film. Mm-hmm. And from my point of view, the best one is a visual one. Okay, it's the one scene where Bhupati is sitting in the coach and holds in his hand the handkerchief, the embroidery also done by his wife. And that's clearly a reference to Othello. Okay, now Othello thinks he's been betrayed. And of course, Othello is wrong, whereas Bhupati is right. He has been betrayed. I would say she clearly betrays him because you don't need sex to love somebody, right? I mean, she loves his brother more than him. All right, so she is Bovary.
Right. I think the Othello reference is very much there. You're right about that. And Shakespeare is evoked in many places, right? Because even when Bhupati proposes to Amal about his wedding, the first response that Amal has written, the land of Shakespeare, So Shakespeare is very much an idea that is present, and he's an idea, a literary idea, along with the other literary ideas that were an export to India through the Bengali Renaissance, through the access to the English language. I don't know if what you said is really a question or it was meant more as a comment, but the one generative thing that I see from your comment is it's important to recognize that the film is telling us that both these men, Amal and Bhupati, the husband and the brother-in-law, are seduced by a culture, are seduced by a language, by the ideas of that culture, by the ideas of that language. And in that sense, they very much epitomize the 19th century Bhadralok in Calcutta, whose ideas have taken them to a place where they have not quite reached yet, and yet they've not fully left their native culture. So you see that for example, in Bhupati, in the way Bhupati dresses. He dresses like a Western man. He wears trousers and a suit. And this is one of the things that scholars of South Asian historians have commented a lot about. This the schism between the private and the public, between the men's world and the women's world in terms of clothing and in terms of flirting with ideas of the Western world and what that creates, particularly at this time in Bengal. And so I don't know if I would characterize the betrayal quite in the same way that you have. Of course, he's betrayed, but I personally feel that he's betrayed as much by his own lack of vision as he is by his wife. Because he's literally someone who's blind to what is going on right under his nose, not only in terms of what is going on emotionally with his wife, but also in terms of what is going on with the person who's managing his finances. So he's literally blind to certain things. The lofty ideals that he espouses makes him not such a practical man. And Bhupati is trapped within those ideas, those lofty ideals, and is not able to be a man in the moment. Amal is similarly trapped with certain literary ideas. And so I see both these male characters as short-sighted in certain ways. And that's why the metaphor of vision is so important to the film. And in that sense, yes, but of course, Bhupati has been betrayed in a certain way. There's no doubt about that. But we can say that Charu has also been betrayed in many ways to reach where she reaches in the film by both the male characters.
It's getting very late here in Frankfurt. we were nearly at 12 o'clock. So I think we might take that opportunity to thank Priya one more time for your scintillating lecture and fascinating discussion after the film. So let's one last round of applause for Priya coming to us via Zoom from North Carolina. We'll be back in 3 weeks' time on the 4th of July with Bhaskar Sankara on the film Bhaskar Sarkar, sorry, on the film Gupigini Bhagabine. Sorry for the pronunciation there. But yeah. So thank you again, Priya. And yeah, see you guys in 3 weeks' time.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.